Hey you guys, welcome back to the salon. So what I decided to do for today's video was I wanted to kind of start going back through all of the books that I've read in the last few years and pick out some of the ones that were my favorite ones, like from the 21st century, at least so far. Now, I realize that there are only 5 of them on here, and there are a lot of ones that come up on a lot of people's lists that are not on here, but I'm kind of thinking that this will probably be an ongoing series at one point. I didn't want all the videos to be like super long, so I just decided I was just going to go with 5, and these were just the first 5 that I thought of when I thought of this topic. So if your favorite one is not here, or one that I really gushed about is also not on the list and you're surprised by that, don't be, because it will probably be on another video on another list in the future, because I think I'm just going to keep these down to 5. So let's get right into it. So Grady Hendrix, over the past few years, has very quickly become one of my favorite authors working today. And I have read and reviewed like a lot of his books, Horror Store, Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and shit like that. He's just, a great writer. And that's not only because, I'm a graphic designer, and all of his books, most of his books have like really cool graphic design elements to them, and I'm really into that. Also, I want to say too that he wrote a great nonfiction book, like a coffee table book called Paperbacks from Hell, which was all about the horror paperback boom of the 70s and 80s, and it's fucking great. I have it. All of that, like if he had just done all of that, like that would have been awesome just all on its own. But I just have to say too that his fiction is just really amazing. It's just fun. All of his books are just like really entertaining and pretty much everything you would want out of horror. He really has found this very winning formula, which is like the perfect balance of his books being scary, being funny, and also having these really vividly drawn characters that you actually grow to love, like over the course of the book. They're very realistic, and like I said, it's just he just has such a great way with characters. So 2016's My Best Friend's Exorcism has all of that and then some. And matter of fact, it seems like this book in particular was very precisely calibrated to my exact taste and my exact like demographic. So the story is set, most of the story is set in the 1980s, and the characters are almost exactly the same age as I was in the 80s. So I could pretty much relate to every single thing that the kids were doing, and all of the references that were made there, and they're always like kind of made me smile and like took me back to my own childhood as well. Now, as you might have surmised from the title, the story actually concerns demon possession, but it's really so much more than that. The main protagonists are these 2 young girls named Abby and Gretchen, and they live in South Carolina. Now, Abby is kind of like more the main character. We're mostly seeing things from her POV. And she sort of comes from like a more working class background, while her best friend Gretchen, as well as most of the other kids at their private school, actually Abby only goes to the private school because she got a scholarship because she's really smart. So all of the other kids are kind of more upper middle class. So there is like some little bit of class conflict there. The main part of the book actually starts in 1982 when both the girls are 10 years old and they meet for the first time. And I think it was like at a birthday party at a skating rink. And I could totally relate because I think that my 10th or 11th birthday also took place at a skating rink. So I was just kind of like, holy crap. That's what I meant by it's almost like the dude's in my brain and like he wrote this just exactly for me. I just really got that sense while I was reading it. So the whole story, like the bulk of the story, I feel like, is just this really heartfelt exploration of these 2 girls' friendship, like how their friendship develops over the years. And I have to say that I'm actually in awe at Grady Hendrix's portrayal of the girls. I mean, the things that they say, the things that they think, the things that they do, like the way that they act, are pretty much spot on for that age and that era. And I don't think, I mean, not that I can remember offhand anyway, I don't think I've ever read a more accurate account of a very close childhood friendship between 2 young girls like that. I mean, it's just really very sharply observed. And the fact that it was written by like a dude who I don't think was even alive in the 80s is actually pretty amazing. So, I mean, I have to give him like massive props for that. I mean, and I absolutely believed that I was reading about two living, breathing people, so much so that I really got emotionally invested in this book. Like the end of it, which I'm not going to spoil, but it's kind of like a bittersweet ending. I actually kind of teared up at the end, you know what I mean? Because these seemed like real people that we'd gone on a journey with, and it really kind of like affected me in that way. And like I said, I could really relate to the way the characters were because they grew up at the same time as me and they had a lot of the same experiences as I had. So after Gretchen and Abby are established, like, and their friendship is established, the story kind of jumps ahead to when they're 16 years old. And they're hanging out with a couple of other girls, like they have like a little friend group. The other girls named Margaret and Glee. And the four of them actually happen to be hanging out at Margaret's parents' beach house. I think it's Margaret's parents' beach house over the summer. And then they decide they're going to drop some acid. Now, like, they're all kind of scared, too, and I don't think any of them have really done it before, but it's just, like, you have to think, too, this is, like, 80s, 90s, so there's very much satanic panic, say no to drugs, like, all that kind of stuff. So that kind of whole thing is going on in the background, too, which I loved. So they all do it, and then Gretchen, in particular, like, reacts to it very strangely. Like, she kind of wanders off in the woods, they don't really know where she is, they don't know what happened to her, all this other kind of stuff. And after she comes back from it, like after they find her, she slowly begins to change. Like she starts forgetting stuff. She stops like taking care of her personal hygiene. She starts acting really irritable, like, and bitchy, like toward her friends, which she didn't before. And it gets to a point where her behavior has escalated to like such assholery, like, you know, stealing boyfriends and that kind of stuff, where Margaret and Glee are just like, fuck this bitch, and they don't want to like hang out with her anymore. But Abby, I mean, this is her best friend. Like, Margaret and Glee came along later on, but Abby is like actually really worried and thinks something is the matter with her. So she sort of like takes it upon herself. And like I said, she's only 16 years old, that she is going to get to the bottom of what is bothering Gretchen, like what's the matter with her. And you know, she finally comes to the conclusion after she kind of like thinks of like a bunch of other stuff and sort of tries to figure that out. She's like, she comes to the conclusion, well, Gretchen must be, you guessed it, possessed by a demon. And because she loves Gretchen more than anything else in the world, even though she's acting like an asshole, Abby just resolves that she is going to fix this situation, like using whatever means necessary. And like I said, she's only a 16-year-old girl in the 1980s. So she doesn't have a lot of resources at her disposal, but her, you know, love for her best friend is so profound that she is just absolutely willing to go all the way to like fix the problem. So, as I said, like all of Grady Hendrix's stuff, but this one in particular, because I think this one was like the most heartfelt, or this was the one that seemed like to have the greatest like emotional core, at least for me, because I could relate to it a lot. I mean, this is just like a great read. It builds very slowly. Like, I don't know if I'd say it's like slow burn. It's actually not. It's pretty like action packed, but it does kind of start with a foundation of the friendship between these two girls. And then, like, as they get older, it sort of gets into, you know, Mean Girls territory, where it's almost kind of like, you know, the female friendships, like, somewhat become, like, a little bit toxic, and it's just kind of like this whole psychological warfare that they're doing on each other, like girls do sometimes. And as it goes toward the end, and, like, the whole possession angle starts to kind of come to the fore, you get, like, really, really disgusting body horror. And I'm thinking of one scene in particular that had to do with a tapeworm. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. It's like super, super gross. So like I said, this novel has pretty much everything you could possibly ask for in a horror novel. It's gross, it's scary, it's poignant, and it's also really, really funny. And all of those elements like just combine seamlessly into this just beautiful, like, harmonious whole. I mean, it made me laugh, it made me tear up, it made me gag, sometimes all at the same time, and that's a pretty amazing thing for a book to do. Like I said, I can't imagine that anyone wouldn't find some enjoyment in this book. Maybe y'all are out there, but I just love this, and I love all of his stuff, but I think this might be probably my favorite one of his. So I absolutely fell in love with this hefty doorstop of a novel the first time I read it. Not too long after it came out. It came out in 2009, and I think I checked it out of the library, like either in late 2009 or early 2010. I can't really remember. Now, I've always been a big fan of Dan Simmons, And although I will say there's some pretty stiff competition for the crown, this might be my favorite book of his, but it's really, really hard to pick because all of his shit is like, all of his shit that I've read is like really, really good. Now, that said, I would kind of hesitate to recommend this to just anybody or just horror fans in general if I didn't know what your particular tastes were, because this is kind of one of those ones that you have to like a particular kind of book if you're going to get into it. I personally thought this book was brilliant. And I think people who are really into like Victorian era fiction and really complex mysteries, like with a lot of subplots, I think you will probably also dig it if you haven't read it. But if you're just the kind of person that likes more straightforward, like horror stories, like set in the modern day, like with lots of gore and like that's action packed and stuff, you might want to give this one a pass. It's very, very dense and it's very complicated. And like I said, it's set up a lot like a Victorian era novel, like a mystery. That might be a negative for you, but honestly, that was kind of one of my favorite things about it. So Drood is mainly a historical fiction novel with horror and mystery elements kind of woven into the narrative. Now, much like his 2007 novel, which is probably a lot better known, The Terror, which, because, you know, it was made into a miniseries for, I think it was AMC, Drood takes real historical characters and real historical events and kind of he makes everything as period accurate as possible, but then he just constructs this whole fictional story utilizing all of these real characters and these real events, like in this sort of like I said, like a woven tapestry of like reality and fiction. In the case of Drood, our main protagonists are two real 19th century authors, Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens. Now, the story is told as a memoir, so it's all from Wilkie Collins' point of view. Now, for those who don't know, Wilkie Collins was an immensely popular writer back in the day, as popular as Charles Dickens, although his stuff was a little more, I don't know if I want to say it was a little more pulpy, but it's because it's still, I don't know, it's still very literary, like by today's standards, but by the standards back then, like Charles Dickens, I feel like was seen as more like the literary guy, whereas Wilkie Collins was seen more as like the popular fiction guy, but they were absolutely just as famous as each other. Although I will say that Wilkie Collins' novels haven't had quite the staying power, obviously, or the, you know, the literary cachet, if you want to call it, Charles Dickens novels. Although I have read a couple of Wilkie Collins short stories in his novels. I read The Moonstone, I read The Woman in White, and I thought they were fucking great. So, you know, your mileage may vary about that. And honestly, I kind of like his stuff a little bit better than Charles Dickens stuff as a whole. I haven't read all of Charles Dickens stuff, but from what I've read, I just kind of like Wilkie Collins stuff like a little bit better. It's a little more, like I said, it's a little more pulpy, it's a little more gothic, a little more lurid. So I'm kind of like into that a little bit more. So in real life, Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens were friends and collaborated on many writing projects. They wrote a lot of plays together and put on a lot of plays together and so forth. And that comes up in the book as well. Now, I will say I'm not sure how accurate the book is about Collins as a person, like what he was like as a person, because it seems like Dan Simmons did a fuck ton of research, bringing up all kinds of little biographical details and stuff. But obviously, you know, it was a long time ago, and he'd never met the guy because he's been dead a long time. So I don't know like how much of his personality that comes out in the book is like extrapolation. But in the book, and this is so great, in the book, Wilkie Collins is essentially like this gouty, kind of petulant, like resentful little bitch much of the time. And he's also an opium addict, which I believe he was in real life. And he's sort of like in a low-key competition / rivalry with Dickens because, you know, they're always trying to like one-up each other and shit like that. So I have to say that Wilkie Collins in this book, even though he's not, I wouldn't call him a likable character, but he is a very, very wildly entertaining character. And so everything like from his point of view, like I said, he's so bitchy and it's so great. Now, at the beginning of the story, Charles Dickens is on a train that derails off a trellis into this massive ravine. Now, I believe that this was actually based on a real train accident. I don't remember, like, I think Charles Dickens was actually in a train. He survived, obviously. So I think this is based on a real thing. So Charles Dickens and the other people in his first-class car, like, who includes, like, his mistress and I think his mistress's mom, so they survive because their car is still like balanced on the trellis and it doesn't fall. But like most of the other cars like fall into the ravine and most of the other passengers are like horribly injured or killed. Now, Dickens goes down into the ravine and is trying to help out like all the injured people. While he's doing that, he spots this intensely creepy man skulking around in the wreckage, like kind of like leaning over the people. At first, it looks like he's trying to like help the wounded people too. The dude is like bald and he's like ghastly pale. Like I was like, he felt like maybe he looked like Nosferatu or like a skull or something. He doesn't have a nose. He doesn't have any eyelids. And he has these little sharp teeth, like they're almost like filed down or something. So he almost kind of like, he looks like a guy, but he also kind of looks like fucked up. Like he looks like a monster a little bit, or like a vampire or something. Now, Dickens gets the impression, like I said, at first he sees him like leaning over the wounded people and he thinks, oh, he's helping people like I'm helping people. But then he notices that when he goes over to the people that this dude has been leaning over, they're dead. So he gets the impression, he doesn't know if this is true or not, but he gets the impression that this guy is almost like death, or he's like sucking their souls out, or he's killing them or something like that. So that's kind of the impression that he's left with. So Dickens tells Wilkie Collins about this incident. And Collins obviously doesn't really buy it, but Dickens starts to become like obsessed with this person whose name he finds out is Edwin Drood. I think he actually tells him that that's his name because he hears his voice. And so he pretty much enlists Wilkie Collins's help in trying to figure out just who this dude is or what he is and what exactly it is that he's up to, like where he came from. So as this mystery unfolds, Dickens and Collins, they have to go down like into these slums that are like an underground sewers, essentially like an underground city, like underneath London. So like and this is the Victorian era, so it's all like really gross and shitty and everything. And there's this whole like other world under there, like full of all these very unsavory characters, like all these criminals and murderers and, you know, drug dens and all this other kind of stuff. So they go into like the literal underworld, looking to find out like who this person is and what he's doing. Now, the great thing about this book is that you can totally just read it as a mystery, like maybe with some supernatural elements, and it works just fine. But it's actually much cooler if you read it as more of like an unreliable narrator chronicle, just kind of like a tale of Wilkie Collins's deteriorating mental state, because it's kind of left unclear because everything is from his point of view. You don't know how much of the stuff that happens is real and how much of it can be attributed to Collins' like opium-addled perceptions and his growing resentment of Charles Dickens. Like there comes a point like later on where he actually thinks, well, I have to kill him, and like he starts planning to do that. So he's just like obviously losing his mind kind of. So you don't really know how much of this stuff is real, but I really kind of liked that ambiguity. I kind of think, I don't know, in my perception, I think a lot of it didn't happen, or it didn't happen the way that Wilkie Collins thought it did, but you can read it either way. It totally works. So whether you like this book or not, as I mentioned, is largely going to depend upon how you feel about Victorian era literature, because this very much feels like a book from that time period. I mean, it's very dense and literary, but not, it's easier to read than something from back then would have been. But the structure of it and a lot of the language and stuff like that is essentially like kind of the same, because like I said, it's told from the point of view of a man of that era. Now, I don't think you would necessarily have to be intimately familiar with the works of Charles Dickens and or Wilkie Collins to appreciate the book, you know, anyway. But I think that some familiarity with their lives and with their work does lend the narrative like a richness that you might not get otherwise, because there are so many real people and real events like laced throughout the narrative, and there's like a lot of cool little like Easter eggs in there that like refer to some of their other stories and stuff like that. Because to be honest, the whole thing about Drood is that in real life, Charles Dickens's last novel, which was called The Mystery of Edwin Drood, like he didn't finish it, like he died before he finished it. So I like that Dan Simmons like took that last unfinished novel and said, oh, well, this was where the inspiration for this came from, and then kind of like wove this fictional narrative from there. So I think it was like a great idea. So as I said, this is much more like a creepy, unsettling mystery that kind of goes off on a bunch of different tangents than a straight ahead like standard horror novel. But I think this might be legitimately one of the most immersive novels that I ever read. Because I mean, it's a chunker. It's like, it's really, really long. So you really kind of get enmeshed in the world. And I really, really got into that. And honestly, I'm still dying for somebody to make a miniseries adaptation of this like they did with The Terror. I think that would be so fucking great. And The Terror was great too, but I think this would be like a whole other level of shit. Now, like I said, I heard Guillermo del Toro like a long time ago. Like, I think when the book first came out, he was interested in doing an adaptation, but I don't think anything ever came of it. And like, that was a long time ago now. So I'm assuming it's never going to get done. But, you know, today in the age of streaming services, and as far as I know, like the miniseries of The Terror was, you know, kind of got a big buzz about that. So I kind of feel like maybe eventually, I'm still hoping that somebody will make a miniseries of Drood, because it would be fucking great. So when Penpal by Dathan Auerbach came out back in 2012, I feel like it immediately got really, really divided reviews. It seemed like most people just rapturously loved it, like I did, obviously. But there was also like a really vocal contingent that really, really hated it, said it was poorly written, which I don't get, but whatever. I had actually missed kind of the whole hype train, like when this first came out back in 2012, because I didn't actually read it until 2020 or 2021, something like that. And when I heard about all of the divisive reviews, like when it first came out, I was actually kind of surprised that some people had such animosity toward it, I guess, because I thought it was outstanding. I guess I can kind of see it, just maybe because some people don't like horror novels particularly that aren't like a linear narrative or something like that, because this one is a little bit, it's more of like a fragment type of story. I don't want to go too far in that direction and say that it's just like all over the place, because it's not, but it's not told as like a linear narrative, and I think some people don't like that, so maybe that's kind of why. Maybe that's what pissed people off. I don't really know. I can't really say. So the novel actually got its start as a one-off short story, I believe, called Footsteps, that was posted on the No Sleep subreddit. Now, Dathan Auerbach, who I believe posted it under the handle 1,000 Vultures, he was actually writing as though, like you do on No Sleeper, and so it's a creepypasta, so you're supposed to like, you know, it's a fictional story, but you're saying it like it really happened to you. So he's writing as though it was an actual childhood memory, and he tells how he remembered when he was a little kid, waking up on his front porch like at night, and it's cold out, and he's laying there in his underwear, and he doesn't remember how he got there. Now, in the story, he claims that his mother said, yeah, that never happened, but he has a memory of it, so he's like, well, did it really happen? And she's just telling me it didn't to fuck with me, or was it a dream, or what? So this story, Footsteps, got a really positive response, like from some of the other people on the subreddit, and a bunch of the other posters asked Dathan Auerbach to continue the story because they wanted to see like what happened next. So he just kept adding like other little kind of interrelated stories, and they got so popular that eventually he sort of turned the whole thing into a novel, which, like I said, I believe he self-published at first. But it came out in 2012. But it initially started as just like a bunch of interconnected short stories, or vignettes, like, essentially. So the book is told from the perspective of a kid. It's probably a boy, I'm assuming, because the author is a guy, but I don't think it's ever specified, so you could totally read it as a girl. I don't remember any particular thing having say it was a boy or a girl. So this person, the narrator, lives in a suburb in the southeastern U.S. somewhere. I'm led to assuming it was the panhandle of Florida, because that's where the author is from, in what seemed to be like right around the 80s or early 90s, somewhere like that, because it takes place like over a several-year period. So as I mentioned, it's told less as kind of like a single narrative, like unified narrative, and it's more like a series of increasingly disturbing, interconnected vignettes, or like short stories. I don't want to say short stories because they're not really standalone. They are kind of standalone. I don't know. It's hard to explain. Now, some of the events take place when the narrator was in like kindergarten or first grade or something like that. Some take place when he was a teenager, like 14, 15. And some are apparently like written from the present day as he's looking back on his past, like remembering stuff that happened to him when he was a kid. Now, the vignettes are not necessarily in order. They're actually more thematically linked than told in like a linear timeline. I actually really liked this approach to the book, and I think maybe this was the thing that maybe turned some people off it, but I really liked it because the book kind of, the stories they slowly add like little pieces of this much larger puzzle, in a way that kind of mimics the way human memory actually works. So you're kind of like reminiscing about, hey, this one thing that happened when I was a kid, and then jumping off from that was like another thing that was thematically limited. So it kind of like gave me that kind of thing. So to me, it like flowed very organically, but again, like your mileage may vary. So the first part of the book is a version of the original Footsteps story that he posted on No Sleep, where the narrator woke up in the middle. Now, he changed it a little bit, but because in this one, he actually wakes up in the middle of the night and he finds that he's like out in the middle of the woods, like behind his house, and he can't figure out how he got there. Like, he didn't sleepwalk there, obviously, because his feet aren't dirty. So we're not sure at first if someone carried him out there and left him there for whatever reason, or if there's something supernatural going on. So right away, you're really like invested in this, going, man, this is some creepy shit, like, because it's just this random occurrence, and everything just kind of builds off from there. Now, as I said, some of the significance of some of the stories doesn't really come to light until you've read the whole book, which is another thing that makes this like just a really satisfying experience. You're constantly having realizations about vignettes you've already read, whose whole context shifts like once you read one of the later stories. You know what I mean? It's almost kind of like it's almost kind of like filling in blanks like as it's going on. So this is a book too that really, really rewards like a second reading as well, like because you know everything and after you finish the book, and then when you go back and read, you're like, oh yeah, you can pick up all the threads and everything like that. So it's one of those kind of like really benefits from a second read type of thing. Now, so the second part of the story, like the second vignette, I guess, is called Balloons. And the narrator is talking about when he first met his friend Josh in kindergarten, and also about this school project that they were doing, with their kindergarten class. What they're supposed to do is they're supposed to, which this seems like they would never do this nowadays because this is just like trouble waiting to happen. But this was supposed to be back in the 80s. So you're supposed to write a little letter telling like your name and address and your hobbies and shit like that. I mean, they're 6-year-old kids, whatever. And, what they're interested in. And then they're supposed to attach these letters to balloons and let the balloons go and hope that whoever finds the balloon, like, writes back to them and, like, becomes their pen pal. So, like I said, they would never do that nowadays. And actually, if you read this book, you're like, yeah, that's why they would never do this nowadays, because it goes so wrong. But yeah, so the narrator's disappointed because at first, like, no one writes back to him. Like, a bunch of the other kids in the class, like, they get letters in return, and he's just like, what the fuck? Like, my pen pal is just, like, so lame. It's like, I didn't get anything. But then about 6 months later, like, even after the project is, like, all the other kids have, like, stopped getting letters because, like I said, no one's going to write to a 6-year-old for that long that you don't even know. But 6 months later, like, the narrator gets something in return in an envelope. All that's in the envelope, though, and this, again, I love, like, little random shit like this because it's so contextless, and you're just like, what the fuck does that mean? In the envelope, all that's in there is this creepy, blurry Polaroid that really seems to have like no significance to anything whatsoever. It's just like the picture of like a building or something like that. It's not even like weird or anything. It's just like a picture of something. It's weird because it's something that you wouldn't take a Polaroid picture of, you know what I mean? And it's like blurry. And then the fact that somebody actually paid for a stamp and like sent it to you, like, why would they do that? That's what's weird about it to me. And so, like, as this rest of the school year goes on, he keeps getting more and more of these blurry photos, and they're all just pictures of, like, random shit. So it's just, like, really, really disquieting. Like I said, none of the pictures are overtly scary, but it's just they're scary because you have no idea, like, what the person taking them, like, what their motives are, because why the fuck would you take a picture of just, like, someone's, just, like, a fence or, like, a backyard or, like, something like that, and it's just, like, blurry, and then why would you send them to a 6-year-old kid who you don't know? So, yeah, it's very, very sinister in that way. So, essentially, as you follow the threads of all the vignettes, it becomes clear that someone is stalking this kid, but you don't really get the full picture of what was going on until all of the fragments like fall into place at the end. So as I mentioned, I just love like the structure of this book. It was kind of like, I don't want to say it was like scattershot, like it was all over the place, but it's almost laid out like a series of interconnected like memories, like one jumping off the other, but it's also filtered through a child's perception. So a lot of the scary things that were happening around the kid at the time sort of went completely over his head, either because he didn't have the sophistication to understand what was happening, or because, or because his mom actually like kept a lot of things from him that you as the reader don't find out until later on, like after he's already grown and his mom is telling him, oh yeah, all of this happened that you didn't know about because she was kind of like running interference. So there was a lot more shit going on than he perceived at the time, and you don't find that out till later. So that's like really great. So this was easily one of the most insidiously creepy things that I think I've ever read. And the fact that it was not only grounded in reality, but also sort of largely ambiguous and also kind of hemmed in by the limited awareness of its protagonist, who's largely a kid when he's, the memories that he had, that made it much scarier to me. It had that like immediacy that people really love so much, like in creepypasta stories, but it's also just kind of like cryptic enough to keep you invested, keep you interested, and like keep your imagination working overtime. I think it's just like a really, really brilliant novel, and it's just so great that I believe it was his first one. I mean, like I said, he'd been writing, I think he said when he wrote the short stories on No Sleep, he was like, yeah, I could write a story like that, and he posted it. It was a huge success. And then when he started putting them all together, he's like, I never wrote a novel before, so I didn't really know what I was doing. And I was like, well, you did good. You did real good, because I really, really liked this book a lot. So I've read a pretty significant portion of Stephen King's work over the years, including pretty much all of his classic stuff. But I admit that I haven't really kept up with a lot of his 21st century stuff. Not necessarily because I think it isn't as good as his classic work. I haven't really read enough of it to make that judgment. But mostly it's because he just writes too fucking much for me to read it all, dude. I mean, just Christ. And I mean, I have a bunch of other books that I want to read too, Mr. King. And I only have so many hours in the day. So, I regret that I can't really like keep up with his stuff the way I used to. Because like I said, back in the old days, like I used to read all of his stuff like as soon as it came out. Now, I actually came across his 2014 novel, Revival, completely by accident. I actually didn't even heard of it until I found it while I was just browsing through a used bookstore, and I was just like, oh, okay. So I read the inside flap. I'm like, oh, that sounds pretty cool, like for the synopsis of it. And I mean, even Stephen King's kind of like mediocre stuff is still like pretty damn good. It's still pretty entertaining. So the book was only $8 like for the hardback. So I was like, why not? So I picked it up. And to my utter befuddlement and shock, it ended up being one of my favorite Stephen King novels of all time. And I know it's a bold statement, but it was really good. I really, really got into it. So Revival definitely has elements of Frankenstein, plus there's some Lovecraft in there, like maybe toward the third act, and some Bradbury. This very much reminded me of kind of like Something Wicked This Way Comes, that kind of vibe, like particularly some parts of it. That's kind of like a stew of all those influences. And aside from all that, which is already incredible, like you've already perked my interest, like with those three things, it also ends up being kind of like a lot of his later stuff has been, I feel like. It's almost kind of like a meditation on aging and about maybe like loss of faith in an afterlife, things like that. How grief can sort of like warp one's perceptions and even like turn you into a monster in some ways. And also the risks inherent in pursuing forbidden knowledge. So, very much like a Frankenstein type of theme. So in the book, we're following a character named Jamie Morton. Now, we start out in the 1960s when he's just 6 years old. At the beginning of the story, the small town where Jamie lives gets this kind of young, hip, new pastor, and his name is Charles Jacobs. And he's just a genuinely very nice man. Like, I think at the beginning of the book, I was like, oh, is this going to go like the pastor, like molesty kind of route? But it didn't. Like, it's not like that. It's a completely different story to that. So this is actually like a genuinely nice man at first. And he has a beautiful wife and this adorable baby son. And it's just like all happy trees and unicorns and shit like that. So Pastor Jacobs is really into electricity as a hobby. Like he has like a little shed out behind the house where he works on it, tinkers and does all that kind of stuff. And he builds a lot of his own little gadgets. He builds his own batteries and his own gadgets to use in his sermons largely. Like, for example, like one of the funniest ones is he built this little bitty battery-powered Jesus, which I'm already like cracking up thinking about it. And it kind of travels along a little track, so it looks like he's walking on water. Like he has this little environment, like for Jesus to go, woo, he's walking on water. So, which I loved that. That just like really made me chuckle. But so right away, that's kind of another one of, I want to say maybe one of the sub themes, or one of the things that comes up a lot, like during the plot, is kind of the parallel between religious miracles and like carny tricks or magic tricks, things of that nature. So not too long into the story, there is a horrible random car accident which kills Pastor Jacobs' wife and son, like so wipes out his whole family. And from that point on, and it wasn't even anybody's fault, it was just like completely accidental, so completely random. From that point on, understandably, he completely loses his faith to a point where he just doesn't believe there's any purpose to anything anymore. And he gives a sermon, in the book they call it like the terrible sermon, and it was like this big turning point like in the history of the town or whatever. So he gives a sermon like saying pretty much that, like, no, nothing means anything, God doesn't give a shit, that kind of thing. And after that, he again, not surprisingly, gets fired, and almost everybody in this very religious little town like kind of shuns him, turns against him. Although Jamie does like stick by him because he thinks he's like a nice man and he feels bad about what happened to him. So we then jump ahead several years to Jamie as a teenager. And he's kind of like finding his identity. He's like learns, he's a musician. So he picks up like all these instruments and stuff and joining bands. And so there's a lot of stuff about that. And then we follow him kind of on his downward spiral into heroin addiction. Now, sometime in the 1970s, when Jamie's pretty much like hit rock bottom, he's like wakes up in this Fleabag hotel and he's like peed his bed and all this other kind of stuff. And then he goes to the county fair to score some more drugs. And he ends up running into his old friend, Pastor Jacobs, who is now going by the name of Charlie. And Charlie is now on the carny circuit. And, remember all the stuff about the electricity hobby. What he's doing is he's selling these things called portraits in lightning. And these things that he does, I can't really explain it, and I'll just like leave it like if you want to read the book, but nobody can figure out like how he does it. It's like some Tesla shit. Like nobody can really like explain like how he does them. So it almost kind of seems like supernatural. Basically, like, so they meet up again. Jamie starts going into withdrawal and like passes out and stuff like that. So Charlie ends up like rescuing him. And over the course of a little while, they kind of like, reconnect, become friends again. And Charlie uses what he terms his secret electricity, like all of these experiments that he's doing, to rid Jamie of his addiction, or so it seems. Like as it goes on, you discover that maybe this isn't as miraculous as it seems, because there's all kind of like side effects. That's all I'm gonna say. So then the book skips ahead again and then starts going in a decidedly more Lovecraftian kind of direction, because Charlie's experiments with electricity start yielding like stranger and stranger results as time goes on, up to and including piercing beyond the veil of death. Because like I said, Charlie lost his entire family like back, so obviously he wants to, very much like Dr. Frankenstein, where he's trying to like revive the dead or like bring back the dead, or see if he can like look past death into what's going on out there. But as it goes on, like the guy becomes almost like a super villain. And so it kind of comes down like Jamie sort of feels obligated to find him and stop him before he causes any more harm. The title Revival, I have to say, is actually the absolutely perfect title for this book, because over the course of the story, the word kind of takes on multiple meanings. Like it refers at some points to like a literal religious tent revival, but it also refers to revival from the dead, and it also refers to revival from just hitting rock bottom in your life with drug addiction or whatever, and then finding your way back into the light, as it were. So, it has like a triple meaning. Now, though the first 2/3 of Revival are kind of less a cut and dried horror novel and more like the story of one guy's like trials and tribulations, like throughout the years, like as he's growing up, it absolutely does go full on like existential horror in the last third of it. And, there's like all these fucking just fucked up shit happening with this secret electricity with Charlie, like I said, almost becoming a super villain. There's all these like horrible visions of what could possibly lie out there, like like past the boundaries of the universe and stuff like that. So like I said, very, very very Lovecraftian. So I have to say that even though I hadn't heard of this book, like, prior to me finding it, like, in a bookstore. This was a really unexpected treat. You know, I have to say, like I said, easily just shot right up to one of my favorite Stephen King novels of all time. Had a very likable, relatable protagonist, and a story that also, like, kept you really engaged, but also went off in all kinds of surprising directions. Because when I first started reading it, I wasn't sure. I was like, well, it could go in this, I could go that way, it could go this way, it could go that way, but it really, like, kept surprising me and going off in directions I absolutely did not expect, and I really, really loved that. So I will say, if you haven't really read much of King's newer output, just because you have the perception it's not as good or anything like that, this is a really good one to kind of dip your toe back into, like, his newer stuff, because this is actually really, really great. And again, this is one that I think would make a fantastic movie, or, you know, probably a miniseries would be better because it's very, very long. But, you know, so we'll see. Maybe we'll get that one of these days. So the Argentinian author, Agustina Bazterrica, hopefully I'm sort of pronouncing that right. Her second novel, Tender is the Flesh, which came out in Argentina, I believe, in 2017, but actually wasn't released in English translation until 2020. It got a metric fuck ton of awards when it came out, and it ended up on so many people's year-end best of lists, like in 2020, that, you know, you could be forgiven for believing the book was totally overhyped, because it actually was, like, really, really hyped a lot. But I'm going to say it wasn't overhyped. I think it's every bit as good as advertised, at least in my opinion. Maybe some people didn't like it. Now, unlike the previous books that I've listed, which I kind of feel like most of them would probably be okay and, like, appeal to, like, a more of a mainstream horror audience, this one probably needs a big old content warning, because this whole entire novel is just packed to the fucking ribs with the grimmest shit imaginable. And it literally never pulls back from the misery for even a single second. Not that I remember. I don't remember any single second of hope or joy or anything like that. So there's all kind of bad shit in there. There's industrialized cannibalism. There's horrible rape. There's horrific animal cruelty. All of it is laid out in very, very graphic, matter-of-fact detail. So if stuff like that bothers you, this is probably not something that you want hanging out in your brain, because it absolutely will hang out in there forever, probably. Also, if you're a meat eater, this might make you skip the burgers, at least for a couple days. And if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, this story will probably validate your life choices. This didn't get me to stop eating meat, but I was, like, reading it kind of like, ew, you know what I mean? But yeah, so I don't know how you're going to feel about that, but so I'm just warning you ahead of time. So Tender is the Flesh is essentially like a dystopian fable. You know, kind of the same ballpark as, like, Animal Farm, you know, the George Orwell story. Maybe Cormac McCarthy's The Road. That's not really a fable, but, you know, just in the sense of being almost kind of like misery porn, I guess. Like, I know that sounds reductive and everything like that, but it's kind of like that. You really have to be in the mood to, like, want to read something like that. But yeah, this contains... Not that I remember, it doesn't contain any humor, no levity, no anything like that whatsoever. It's just kind of like a litany of unrelenting horror and tragedy and sadness. It's just like a huge, huge bummer. Now, like many fables, it's not necessarily supernatural, but it is exaggerated to make a point. So some of the events are not necessarily supposed to be entirely realistic. So, because I feel like that was sort of a criticism that I saw a lot. It's like, well, it wouldn't happen like this or something like that. I'm like, well, that's not the point of the book. It's a fable. It's supposed to be sort of grounded in reality, but it's supposed to be exaggerated for effect. So that's what it is. So, like, know that going into it. So the story takes place either in our near future or in an alternate future, where there's been an epidemic, which I guess would kind of like similar to rabies or something like that, and it spread to all the animals on Earth, making the animals' meat no longer safe for consumption by humans. And not only that, but through propaganda, everyone has become so wigged out by the idea of animals spreading the virus to people that even representations of animals, like pictures or drawings or something like that, are now illegal, because the higher-ups, the governments and everything like that, apparently want all idea of animals, as well as the animals themselves, eradicated. So they're basically wiping out, they're just like burning like cows and horses, like every animal like is just getting burned. You're obviously not allowed to have any pets of any kind or anything like that, and you're not even allowed to have like pictures of animals or anything. They just want the whole idea of it wiped off the face of the earth. Unfortunately, though, people aren't willing to forego eating meat. even when they can't get it from animals anymore. And like I said, in this world, in this alternate future, it's apparently not a thing that you can like make synthetic meat or whatever. So the government decides that they're going to bring in a program where humans will be farmed for consumption. So not all humans, obviously, but they're going to have like, humans that are specifically bred for that, just like they would do with animals. Now, the society where this is taking place is clearly very stratified. The middle class and above, you can purchase what they call these special meat from just regular shops like butcher shops or whatever. But the poor obviously like have to feed on dead bodies if they want meat. So yeah. So also, people eating dead bodies. That was another thing that I forgot to mention in the content warning that I gave you earlier. Now, the main protagonist of the book is named Marcos, and he's a manager at one of these human meat processing plants. And as you might imagine, this plant is set up pretty much just like a modern day like animal processing plant is nowadays. Now, the book is divided into two parts. In the first half, kind of rough two parts. The first half, the reader is mainly following Marcos like around on his job, like at the processing plant. So most of Marcos's kind of day-to-day duties, that kind of entails him going around to different companies like hotels, schools, shit like that, and picking up their orders and figuring out like what kind of humans they want for whatever their meat needs happen to be. So the way this part of the novel is laid out is actually like a really good, like a really effective way to introduce this world, because you get to see different aspects of the society and you start to understand how this essentially legalized and industrialized cannibalism has affected the populace as a whole. I mean, mainly what it's done is diminish the sense of empathy toward other human beings. I mean, obviously toward animals because nobody sees them anymore, but it just has like, eroded like people's sympathy and empathy for other humans as well because we're eating some of them. This has kind of come about due to a campaign of dehumanization of the humans that have been bred for food, which are never referred to as humans. They're just referred to as head or product, and they're branded just like cattle are. They have their vocal cords removed to stop them from screaming when they're slaughtered. And in some cases, like the cases of pregnant women, they have their limbs cut off. And that they do that to pregnant women, like to keep the women from harming their fetuses, since baby meat is naturally, as it would be, a very popular delicacy, and it's like really expensive, so they don't want the pregnant ladies like messing up the baby meat. And fair warning, I feel the need to put another content warning here. If it wasn't clear from everything that I've said so far, the story very, very explicitly describes every single stage of the slaughtering and butchering process. So I wouldn't recommend reading this while you're eating, unless you're into that kind of thing, then you do you, whatever. But I'm just saying, like, it's pretty gross, and if you don't like that kind of thing, then maybe skip it. So while we're following Marcos in his workaday capacity, we're also getting a little bit of backstory as to sort of like what's going on in his personal life. So his wife Cecilia has left him, mainly because she couldn't deal with the fact that the baby that they had tried so hard to conceive, like they did IVF and everything like that, and they finally had a baby and they were like super overjoyed. But the baby died, like a crib death, like there was no reason for it or anything like that, and it was just like a random death. So she couldn't really deal with it, and she ended up leaving and like going and living with her mom or whatever. Marcos is also having a really rough time dealing with the loss of his son and also with the loss of his wife, so it's kind of a lot. Marcos's dad is also suffering from dementia, and he's declining very quickly. And Marcos kind of feels obligated to keep working at the plant, which he hates, like because he finds it very barbaric, just because he wants to be able to afford to give his dad like the most comfortable twilight years possible, like he's keeping him in a home. Now, at about the halfway point of the story, Marcos receives from a client a very, very valuable gift in the form of a head, a woman who has been bred for meat. Now, she is actually like very special because she's what this society calls FGP, which stands for First Generation Pure, which essentially means that, it's gonna sound fucked up, but it essentially means that her meat is organic. She was organically born. Now, as you might imagine in this type of society, and just like they have with meat nowadays, some humans like that are bred for meat are actually like genetically engineered or stuff full of hormones, like, you know, so their marbling will be better or whatever. But this woman was actually just born in the regular way. So again, she's organic, and this is like very, very sought after, like this kind of meat. Now, Marcos is not really entirely sure what to do with her. Like, he's happy with the gift and everything like that. So he keeps her tied outside, like in the barn or whatever, and gives her food and water. And he ends up like debating. He's like, well, should I take her to the butcher and get her slaughtered? Shit like that. Like, because like everyone else in this world, Marcos has been conditioned to see this woman as food and not as a person. But slowly, his perception of her starts to change. And he kind of starts seeing her more as a person and less as like a slab of meat. And I'm going to say, like I said, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but you think the novel is maybe going to go in a more hopeful direction. Like, hey, Marcos is going to learn that this head, like, is, you know, is not just meat. It's a person, too, and has the same emotions and feelings as he has. And that's going to make him, like, grow a pair and, like, buck up and fight the system. But this book is a lot more ruthless than that, but I guess you could say it's like a lot more realistic, like as far as the situation that it's laid out, you know, as far as that context is concerned. Honestly, the end of this book made me feel like I'd been punched in the stomach. And like I said, I'm not going to spoil it, but I'm going to say, like, yeah, it doesn't necessarily end well, like, or the way that you might be hoping. Now, one of the main themes of this book, similar to some of Orwell's themes, obviously, is that language forms thought. And if you can be sort of convinced to feel okay about something, like through the use of euphemisms and stuff, then shit can get pretty horrific and you'll be fine with it, because you're just kind of like, you know, it's just sort of like easy. Yes, we have euphemisms for everything to like make it sound like it's not so terrible. So that's kind of like a main theme of this book as well. The novel is obviously also a polemic against factory farming, and it shows in very vivid and quite revolting detail like how animals are killed and butchered, and also sort of like rubs the reader's face into the fact that we're more grossed out and horrified by it when the same thing is happening to a human, when we might not necessarily be as affected by it when it's happening to an animal. So it's kind of like pointing out that hypocrisy. I'm not saying that this is a pleasant book to read, because it's not, but it does kind of have sort of like a sick power. Like I said, you really have to be in the mood like to read, so it's really not for everybody. But I mean, if you're just like feeling too happy about life and you're in too good of a mood one day and you want to just like wallow in despair for a little while for a little bit of spice, a little bit of variation, then this is a great piece of literature in that regard. But like I said, it's a huge bummer. It will probably just like make you maybe want to kill yourself like at the end just for a little while. But it's still like a really, really great book. And I would recommend it if all of the stuff that I said before like didn't discourage you from reading it. So that will do it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. And like I said, I'll probably do some more installments in this, because 5 books is really not that many. There's a bunch of other ones that I want to feature in the future. So, you know, hopefully I'll do some more of these going forward. So again, thanks for watching, and remember to like, share, subscribe, and go to scaresalon.com, where there's a bunch more written content about books and movies that you can read and enjoy. And I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.